Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Creative Mind podcast, where we discuss psychology and its influence on culture from a Christian perspective. My name is Ashley Hageman. I'm a licensed counselor and adjunct professor of psychology. And today we are talking the psychology of money with my favorite guest that I've ever had, my husband, Grant Hageman. So, Grant, tell me a little bit about yourself. What is your current vocation? Describe your work and introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Grant. I'm a financial planner and I work for an independent firm called Family Focused Financial. We're based out of Southwest Michigan and we help guide people into and through retirement. And so we just love helping people make good decisions with their money. And yeah, it gives us a lot of joy to do that.
Yeah, so you currently are working retirement planning, but it's been
hmm
kind of a journey getting there. And
hmm
I think a lot of that journey is going to have a relation to the discussion we're going to have today. So tell me a little bit about what led you to your current vocation and some of the experience in the past that have really enriched your experience to be able to serve people well in this capacity.
Yeah, well, I guess from a young age, I've always wanted to be financially responsible. When I was in high school, I ran across a proverb. It was Proverbs 22:7, and it says, "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a slave of the lender." And when I read that, I was, it struck me. I'm like, I don't want to be a slave. I want freedom. And so it kind of sent me on a lifelong journey towards financial responsibility. And I was in my early 20s trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do with my life. I knew that I wanted to work with people in some capacity. And so I found a job where I could do that, but it wasn't involving finances. And I think after I got married to our host, Ashley, we were kind of discussing what next steps I wanted to take in my career. And I believe you actually suggested I look into finance of some kind, just because we were at that time in our life we were really focused on our finances. We had to be very careful, and we were starting to get really passionate about budgeting and debt payoffs and things like that. And so that kind of led me into the financial realm. I started off in banking just to kind of get my feet wet. I dabbled a little bit in insurance sales before I decided to take the plunge in financial planning proper.
And I remember one, I think, example of sort of your bent or your natural inclination towards this field. I remember when we first got married, it was like we got back from our honeymoon and we met with a lady from the bank who had your like investment that you had, your savings so far, and you're like, I want you to be on this meeting with her just so you know our accounts and everything like that. So I sat in on the meeting and I'm sitting here and you are and this was before you were in any kind of financial field. You had and you hadn't had any financial education or anything like that. And I just felt so like this conversation is over my head. You were talking to her on all of these things and I was like, I understand maybe about half the words that you're using and I'm trying to follow. I'm really trying. And I just felt like you A, understood it, but B, it was a passion for you that you really
Mhm.
enjoyed telling your money what to do and planning for the future. And that kind of really, you had a passion for that. And so I think that that was an indication to me of, hey, maybe this is something that you might want to consider for a career at some point.
Yeah, and so I have my own personal job counselor over here that I got married
That's
to.
right.
So that really helped me set myself towards a very good future. So it really works. It does work well with me and what I'm passionate about and my skills. So
And you also, what was your bachelor's in? Tell the people.
yeah. So I got my bachelor's in psychology, not knowing really what to do with it. But again, as I said before, knew I wanted to work with people in some capacity. And the field of psychology was very interesting to me. And so I just decided to get my degree in that. No exact plan of how I was going to end up using it. But interestingly, finance is almost more about behavior in psychology than it is about numbers and math. And so I think it really helped me pursue this field because I have that experience in psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to tell my students in my because I teach an intro to psych, and so I get people from all majors. It's a required class.
Hmm.
And so some of the ones that are in fields like finance or business, things like that, they don't always connect with the material as much because they think it's irrelevant. But I always try to tell them like, hey, no, there's actually a lot here that connects. There's a lot that's going to really help you in your career in understanding people because that's a big part of money and the way that people use their money
Hmm.
and we'll get into that.
Yeah, there's a whole wing of the financial industry called behavioral finance, and it's very steeped in psychology, studies about human behavior and the way we think about money.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's
Which
it's a
makes
really
sense.
yeah, it's a really big part of finances.
So, how much of your job do you think is dealing with the people aspect of things and sort of the more relational aspect? And how much of it is really more of the numbers and the trades and things like that, and the technical things?
Yeah, it's going to be different for each financial advisor because each advisor will work a little differently, and the kinds of relationships they have with their clients will all be a little different. At Family Focused Financial, we are more people oriented than numbers oriented. And so I would say we're maybe a little bit further on the relationship side. A lot of our conversations have little to do with math and numbers. It has more to do with the values our clients have, the goals that they're wanting to work towards, lifestyle questions, and just building relationships with people. And so I would say we're on the side of the industry where we're more focused on the people and the human aspect of finances.
So, what types of conversations do you have with people? What are the more specifics of how that might play out?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of conversations, questions about family relationships come up a lot, especially as people are thinking about how to leave their money behind if they were to pass away, or relationships between married people, marriage relationships where they may not be on the same page in the way they use their money and some of their goals and fears may not be in alignment. So trying to work with them on having a unified way forward with their finances. A lot of times, just when it comes to investments, working with people on responding to investment risk and loss versus reward. And that's even though there's numbers involved in that question, there's a lot of psychology built into that as well, as people are really trying to balance
Yeah.
out this seeking opportunity but also trying to avoid any type of loss, and there's a lot of psychology involved in that, almost more than it's about a numbers game. Lifestyle issues like budgeting, we get into that a little bit. It's usually not the biggest part of our clientele are discussing budgeting, but it is something we get into pretty regularly. Debt payoffs, how can we change our lifestyle so we can live within our budget with extra so we can put towards our debt or we can start to invest for the future? That's a really big question. And it requires a lot of changes in our psychology and behavior. You're going to have to make changes to your purchasing, which means you're going to have to live a little bit differently. And that can be a little
Yeah.
bit troubling to some people and hard to accomplish. So it's, yeah, a lot of it is more on the human side. We do go through the numbers with people, but that just usually helps them understand the importance of some of the non-numerical aspects of their finances and some of the behavioral things going on.
So what I'm hearing you saying is there's kind of like three categories. I think this is a good maybe outline for our discussion is
Hmm.
the first one would be family relationships and roles and demographics, things like that. Some of the cultural things maybe. The second would be discussing risk versus reward
Hmm.
and what the sort of psychological implications that has. And then the last one would be behavioral changes and how to affect behavioral changes in your finances. Would that be
Hmm.
fair to say? Is like it's kind of like
Yeah.
three categories of discussion. So the first one, so How does the money play out in relationships, especially like marriages and families? What kinds of dynamics do you have to deal with when you're retirement planning and yet you have marriage dynamics going on that can be complex?
Yeah, I realized very early in my career in finance that money is a representation of what people value. And the way people
Mm,
use their money is just the way that their values are being manifested through their behaviors. And
yeah.
so when you have a couple who's married and they have different value systems, that's when there's conflict with their money. For instance, let's say a client wants to spend their money on a nicer car, but their spouse, they don't want to spend their money that way. They would rather spend their money giving some money to their grandchild for college. And right there you can see that one spouse has a value of something that's different than the other spouse. And so when there's differences about the money, it's really a difference of value. And that can be a very big relational issue, especially when it's not as clear cut as simply should we spend our money on X or Y. Sometimes there's deeper values going on, such as sometimes one spouse is very scared about losing money in the market, and the other spouse is scared about keeping money in the bank and missing out on a lot of growth. And how do you balance that out? And so those are two different values that we have to walk through with clients on the right amount of risk for their household to take on
Yeah.
while also capturing the right amount of investment growth.
Yeah, and I think I see that when I talk to people of the way that they use their money and the way that they plan for their money very much reflects their goals and their personality and their values. And so it's something that in a marriage, if you are united on that, then it's going to be a smooth sailing. Your
Hmm.
values and personalities and lifestyle are united. It's going to be a lot easier than if you're having conflict. The money, some people will say, oh, we just fought over money and our marriage didn't work because of the money, and it's like, well, that's really often more of a symptom of
Hmm.
some underlying dynamics going on, and it's not necessarily the money itself that was a problem. It was the difference in value, difference in lifestyle, things that fundamental important issues that need to be worked on so that you can, and the money, working on the money aspect can be an avenue as well
Hmm.
towards working out some of those relational dynamics and
Yeah.
towards healing.
I think something that happens a lot that causes a lot of friction between couples is one of the spouses will be more willing to enjoy their money than the other. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're spending money on their hobbies, they're maybe giving more money away to their friends or some of the family members that they're close with, or they're going out with the guys, going bowling or golfing a lot, and the other spouse is at home very concerned about their future and not spending money, and they don't feel like they can enjoy their money because their other spouse is spending most of it. And so then there's this
Yeah.
sort of resentment that can happen where one of the spouses is having all the fun and the other one is trying to piece everything back together.
Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of cases where that happens for
Hmm.
sure.
And if we go
Yeah.
back to the value side of things, what I would say that boils down to is one of the spouses is valuing their own entertainment and joy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to appreciate all of that, but they're valuing that to the detriment of their spouse, and they're not valuing their spouse's view of that money and how it should be used. And they need to come back together. I think they need to talk about why each potential decision is important to them and have a good compromise on how the money should be spent, how they can both enjoy it together.
Do you feel like you've seen some cases where, one is a spender, one's a saver, and yet they are able to bridge that gap and work really well together?
I've I've seen that work. Typically in every relationship, there's a person who's more inclined to spend and a person who's more inclined to save. That's pretty normal. And so most of the people that I work with have strong relationships. So it's definitely workable within reason. If depends on how extreme on that spectrum each person is. If one person's a
Mhm.
complete saver and the other person's a complete spender, that's going to be a much more difficult, rocky relationship than if somebody's just a
Yeah,
little bit more inclined towards saving than their spouse is.
sure, that makes sense.
But I've seen it work where the spender, they kind of come together, and the one who's more inclined to spend, they'll agree to only spend so much a month. And so they kind of have an allotment for each month of how much they can
Mm.
spend. And as long as they are committed to that, usually things go well.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily a personality difference that makes a difference of whether it can work or not. It's more of the, are people willing to compromise both ways? Are they willing to work together towards
Yeah.
their, is their goal greater together than it is than separate, and being able to overcome those
Yeah.
differences. Yeah, yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
where I think it's really about communication, that it comes down to
Mhm.
communicating well with your spouse and to really understand why they have the viewpoint that they do and why it's concerning to them or why they want to continue doing what they want to do. I think that's important. And as long as we can respect the other person's point of view, I think there's a way that you can come to an agreement of how to move forward together.
I know I took a training once with the Gottmans. I am not a marriage counselor. That was one of the first things that I like ruled off um, in my in my journey. Anything with more than one person in the room is very difficult for me. But I took a really great training with the Gottmans, and they talked about, I think it's like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which are four
Mhm.
traits that kind of are indicate the doom for a relationship in a sense. But the main one they said was contempt. So when you
Mhm.
have a contempt for the other person, you don't have that respect for them. And even if you're, so they said you can be in a really big blow up, a really big conflict. But if you don't have that contempt, you're able to work through it a lot more. But it's so that having that respect is a big, fostering and communicating that respect to the other person, even when you're mad at them or even when you disagree, is a huge way that you can find your way back together. Like that's a
Yeah.
big, big in marriage relationships.
Going back to just the way that could play out is going back to my previous example of, the husband going out with the guys, every weekend and the wife kind of staying home, being very concerned about finances. In that example, one way that that could be resolved is if there's a lot of communication and the wife understood that it's not a bad thing for the husband to want to spend time with his friends. And if the husband can say, it's not a bad thing that you want to be responsible with the money, I think that's just the first foot forward into creating some sort of resolution.
Yeah, is recognizing it's legitimate that those things are important to you.
Right. Right.
Like, even if I don't agree or I have a different viewpoint, it's understanding I get why you think the way you do, and that's a good thing that you think that way. And I
Exactly.
respect that.
And I think
Yeah.
if couples can approach the topic with that as their first foot forward, I think from that point on they could find ways to work together to make it workable for both of them.
I mean, the classic tool that we teach people when in conflict resolution is when someone brings up their grievance to you, the first thing that you do is restate what they said in your own words in a
Mhm.
way that they would agree with. And that's what that's doing, is that that's the communication of respect, the communication of I hear you and I understand your point of view and I respect and value that. And then, but here's why I disagree. And that way you can
Mhm.
focus on the content of the argument instead of, the person, and attacking, you're not attacking the person, you're attacking the content of the argument and working together on through the conflict.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So with a lot of the sort of changing family structures, like more divorces or mixed families with stepchildren, with single people, for example, these sort of different situations, how does that affect retirement planning?
Yeah, we do get a lot of people who are nearing retirement or in retirement, and it's their second marriage. The first marriage fell through, and there's children from past marriages that are in the mix. So now there's two sets of children. And when it comes to probably the biggest obstacle for a family in that somebody with that family structure, the biggest obstacle is going to be deciding how to distribute assets when they pass. A lot of times, one of the spouses is going to bring the larger chunk of their retirement nest egg to the table, and the other spouse will have a much smaller part to bring. So that can get a little tricky of, well, should all the kids get the same percentage? Should one set of kids get a larger percentage and the spouse who's recently brought their kids into the family now get a smaller percentage? So there's a lot of questions about that. We found at our office that over time, second marriages tend to become more unified. Maybe it takes about 10 years for the
Hmm.
financial aspects to become a little bit more unified. I think having gone through a divorce situation in the past, it just takes a little bit longer for things to kind of meld together, but it is possible. And over time, it ends up happening naturally.
So there's kind of that. So it's a greater, when you first get married, your first marriage, it's much more simple to be more unified in your finances and meld things together. With the second marriage, it takes a little bit more time for that to fully feel stable and unified and to see that as the family. But it
hmm
does get there. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
yeah, because when you typically somebody's first marriage is the marriage that they're having their kids with, and if they raise their kids and then they get remarried 30 years down the road, and then there's this new person in this life who has their own set of kids, it could seem a little unfair to the original set of kids that you had to, if you had saved $1 million and your new spouse is only bringing 100,000 to the table, and then you were to pass in 2 years, all of your
Yeah,
inheritance getting split up among her kids, that seems a little unfair. But 10, 15 years down the road, you have maybe a health incident, your spouse is taking care of you this whole time. All of a sudden, that starts to seem a little bit less significant. And maybe her kids
yeah,
are owed a little bit more because she's investing so much into that family now. So there's just a
yeah.
natural way in which the finances of that situation become a little bit less divided and a little bit more unified.
That's really interesting. So, um, moving on more towards some of the demographic type of things, do you see in your office some differences when you're talking to people, like in general? What are you talking with the men versus the women? What are maybe some gender differences that you see happening in relation to how people approach their money in retirement?
Yeah, and it's all general, and this is a little bit anecdotal. I don't have necessarily stats on this, but we've just noticed that oftentimes the we see that men tend to be a little bit more focused on growth than women are. Women tend to be a little bit more risk averse. They don't want to see as much
Hmm.
loss. They also, usually within a couple, one of the spouses is going to have a lot more knowledge about their own financial situation, and the other spouse is relying on on that, and they're not quite as cued into what's going on. Most of the time, tends to be the husband who has a tighter understanding of their finances, and the wife is sort of along for the ride. And there's a lot of trust she's putting into her husband. Sometimes those roles are flip flopped, but just more often than not, it's the husband who is kind of getting everything in order and putting everything together financially. And so that's where I think the wife is often, she has a little bit more fear because she just doesn't have as clear of a picture of their finances as
Sure.
the husband does.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that we do in our office a lot is we put together all the different pieces of someone's financial position, and we're able to show them, our clients, kind of what trajectory they're on as we look into the future. And just that step alone is sometimes the most comforting thing to the wife. I often
Yeah.
find the wife, particularly, her stress level just seems to go down and down and down while she's in my office, because
Yeah.
we're clarifying this is where you're at, and these are all of what we're looking at. These are all the risks
Hmm.
that we're preventing and we're trying to work around, and this is where we think you'll end up given all of these details. So
Yeah.
most of the time, the clients that we're working with are in a really good spot. And even those that aren't, we get to show them the progress that they've made since their last visit. And even that alone can also be really encouraging.
Yeah. That's one thing that was really exciting to me is hearing some of your stories of all very confidential. Want to make that clear. But stories of where you've been able to help people where they come in and they're going to run out of money like
Mhm.
right after retirement and just through a few months of working with you you see so tell the people about your red line report what that is and explain a little bit about yeah.
Yeah, well, we use a software called Retirement Analyzer, and we just nickname it the Red Line Report because when we put all of the different pieces of someone's financial situation into this software, at the very end, it gives a report on if there's any risk that somebody's going to run out of money at some point in the future. And so if there is a year where they're projected to run out of money, there's going to be a red line that shows up. So we just call it for short the red line report, and our goal is to keep pushing that red line further and further into the future until it disappears altogether.
So yeah, so I've heard some times stories where, you know, you work with people and they're able to see that red line go farther and farther
Mhm.
away into the future. And I think there's something so tangible about that that really gets the excitement going. And I think
Mhm.
that's what makes the behavior changes a lot easier is when you start to see in a really tangible way being made. When
Mhm.
you're able to see and this is just universal in life. I mean, people it's with weight loss,
Mhm.
it's the same way. I see a lot with mental health things when people finally start to make changes and they start to see a little bit of progress, they get really excited and then they have the buy-in and then
Mhm.
and then it's like that snowball thing. And I think that's why Dave Ramsey, for example, the way he models his debt payoff program is not necessarily numerically 100% the best way to go about
Mhm.
it, but it's psychologically you see progress sooner in a very tangible way that gets you excited and
Yeah.
makes you want to make those behavioral changes.
Yeah, and that's why again, personal finance is almost more psychological than it is numerical. There could always be the most efficient way of doing things may not be the best way to do it because there's psychological components that need to be factored in. There's motivational issues. And you're exactly right. Debt snowball is mathematically not the best way to pay off debt, but it is the best way to pay off debt psychologically.
Yeah. And what does it matter the best numerical model if you never use it, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it's important practically to know how our minds work, how our emotions work, and
Hmm.
leverage that in the best way possible towards our goals. That's like
Yeah.
huge thing in life changes. Let's talk socioculturally. How do like different sort of sociocultural issues affect the way people think about money? Um,
Yeah, I wouldn't call myself an expert in this area. It's not something that I have a lot of experience with, but I've heard a little bit about it. So just a disclaimer that I'm just kind of speaking from kind of off the cuff here. But I have heard that there is a different classes within our society will respond to money in a different way, especially when you're looking at more of the impoverished communities. That there's particular financial struggles that burden these communities, and there's certain patterns of behaviors that they develop in order to respond to those struggles, and that's very different from the wealthy classes in the US. Particularly family is a really important part of impoverished communities, and you have a lot of extended family there to support you. And for a lot of people, it's very, if they find a way out of sort of poverty and they're able to provide for themselves and then some, is very hard for them to actually get out of poverty because they feel they need to support their entire family. And so
yeah,
there's the very support system that was keeping them going and getting them progress is the very support system that often is a hurdle for them to get over to get out of impoverished community. Because if they start making extra money, well, now they have family, friends who are coming by needing
Hmm.
help. And
Yeah.
they're the ones that relied on that help to get there in the first place. So how could they deny help to their family?
Right.
So it's a really big
Yeah.
social dilemma is how to address that. They want to get ahead of themselves, but they can't. They have to support their cousins. They have to support their aunts and uncles, you know. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but it is a reality that a lot of people face when they're trying to get out of
Yeah.
poverty.
Yeah. I think that's it's a catch-22. It's, yeah, obviously you should help people. And especially if they got you where you are today. And yet at the same time, how can you help them if you're not
Hmm.
stable yourself? It's kind of like the put your own life vest on before
Yeah.
you help other people. But I mean that seems like an easy principle, but in action that's really difficult to know what those boundaries are and to be
Yeah.
able to do it in a loving way. That's, yeah, and there's a lot of social pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard place to be. What about the scarcity mindset of poverty culture?
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of the struggles that people in poverty, and I've heard that this is pretty common in third world countries as well. There's so much need in the moment that it's very hard to think about saving for the future because a lot of these people in these situations they've never really been able to be certain that anything is going to persevere into the future. All they know is their immediate needs, and so that's what they're working with. And so if they do have extra money in the near term, it usually doesn't get saved because it's just something that's not on their radar. They know that tomorrow they're going to have a need as well, and they're going to have the same needs. So it's not like a problem they're necessarily trying to fix. So they'd rather
Yeah.
enjoy the extra that they have now, or again, help their family out, maybe with some needs that their family has. And so that's where saving for the future really just doesn't happen as it should in those communities.
And then I think one thing too in the US in particular is the fear of losing government help
Hmm.
is sort of a barrier to saving because you can't save. If you have savings, then you don't qualify
Hmm.
for a lot of these programs. And then B, I think for a lot of people, this is something that I didn't realize before I started working with people is that for some of them, the most consistent thing that they've had in their life is government assistance.
Hmm.
That is the most stable thing that they've ever had in their life. And so the thought of, and I've seen this with people that I've worked with, the thought of like they might get a good job where they absolutely can, they're making more money than they did through government assistance. All their needs are met. They're doing better, and yet they kind of self implode or self sabotage their job because it's really scary. It's really insecure that you're out here on your own when
Hmm.
you've kind of grown up with and in your adult life, you've had this really consistent thing in your life. And now it's like, hey, you're out on your own. I think that's something that putting myself in that situation it would be really scary. It would be hard to do that and make that change.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times, from what I've heard at least, is that when somebody gets to the point where they're about to get cut off of some sort of benefit, oftentimes the amount of money they're making at the time they're getting cut off is not as much as the benefits they were originally receiving. So it's sort of like a step backwards sometimes for these people to
Oh
actually
yeah.
start making more
Mhm.
money because
Yeah.
then they start losing benefits in a way that's not proportional to the amount of money they're actually bringing in.
Yeah.
So why would you continue to make more money? So
Yeah.
there's a lot
Yeah.
of barriers for progress for people who are on these types of programs.
Yeah, so I think you have to have like a really single-minded goal and be really really committed to that and to
Hmm.
be able to like push through some of these barriers. It's not as easy as people think of
Hmm.
just, hey, just get a job, just try harder, just work harder. It's more complicated than
Yeah.
that. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. There is a lot of mobility between classes, but it is a little bit more of an uphill battle than I think some people realize.
And it's something that's totally countercultural to somebody who's born and raised in a more impoverished community, because most of their family is going to be on some sort of assistance as well. So for them to try and escape all of that assistance, they're doing something that very few people in their community have done. And so it's sometimes easier just to sit back and to not struggle through that uphill climb.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you think that personality differences might affect the way that people manage their money? Do you see when you're meeting with people how different personalities react to the discussions that you're having?
Yeah, in our practice, we say there's two kinds of people: bears and squirrels. Bears like to consume things. Squirrels like to bury nuts in the ground, and eventually they'll forget about them. And those, if they forget about them, that's okay because it'll grow a big tree and drop more nuts for them. And so we have a lot of analogies that we use to describe bears and squirrels, but most people know that there's spenders and savers out there. I find that a lot of people who tend to spend more, they use their money in a way where they're trying to enjoy it. They're trying to get positive emotions out of their money. And a lot of the people who are more of the savers, they're saving predominantly to avoid negative emotions. So there's fear,
Mm.
there's a lot of uncertainty or anxiety about the future, and they're using money as a security blanket.
Hmm.
And then those who are spenders are really just trying to go out and have a good time.
Yeah.
I used to be a very, very deep saver, and it gave me a lot of pain to take money out of my wallet. And I used to be proud of the fact that I wouldn't spend money. And I've since have had a little bit of a change of heart on that matter. I think it's actually not a good thing to be so tight with your money, as my manager calls it. You know, people who are so tight with their money that their pennies have fingerprints on them. Um,
Craig has I love his analogies and his one-liners. They're so great.
yeah.
Anyways, continue.
So yeah. So people who are so tight with their money that they can't enjoy it, and I think God gives us what we have. There's a call to be responsible. There's a call to have wisdom. God doesn't call us to bury all of our talents in the ground and sit on the top of it.
Mhm.
We need to be wise. I think there's a space for us to enjoy the gifts that God has given us as well. And I was convicted of that, and I've been trying to have more trust in God than I do in my money that I've saved, and to be willing to have some enjoyment out of the money that God has given me. So we've gone on vacations and here and there, nothing too elaborate. And we've been, I think, learning how to spend our money a little bit more willingly and enjoy it in the process.
Buy name brand mayonnaise.
We do
Gotta
buy
splurge somewhere, right?
we buy a few name brand items that we enjoy.
Yeah.
Apparently mayonnaise being
Yeah.
one of them.
I mean, that's one of the things that's just priority for us, I think.
Can't beat Hellman's.
Yeah. And American cheese too. You have to do craft.
You have to do craft. Great
You can't
value
do the
is not
knockoff.
is not
Yeah. It's not gonna cut it. It's not
it's
okay.
cheaper.
But I I think what's interesting too on a psychological side with the spending versus saving, it can function. So I like what you said about how the spenders are chasing positive emotion. And so what you see in things like compulsive buying disorder, for example, I just reviewed a book chapter, and so I actually learned a lot from this book chapter. But on compulsive buying disorder, it's it's kind of like similar to gambling where you're chasing that high, that dopamine hit that you're and then so you're chasing it, you get it, and then you have it for a second, but it wears off, and then you're hungry for the next thing, and so that's what the spenders are chasing on, is this cycle. And I mean, I've noticed it myself where you you shop for something, you're on the hunt, that's exciting. And then you find it and you put it in your cart, you click order, and the wait, you're so patient, you're waiting for the item, and you get so excited when it's there, and the unboxing. That's why, I mean, unboxing videos are huge, and to a lot of people doesn't make sense. To me, it really does, because it's that dopamine hit
Hmm.
of opening a new item, and you get excited about it
Yeah.
for a few hours. Even it's not even a lot of times it's not even that long before you're like, okay,
Yeah.
it's just this is just mine now. It's just a normal object in my house. And so I mean, I can 100% understand how that escalated, so that chase after the positive emotion, when especially when you have other things going on in your life, you need some escapism,
Hmm.
um that and some stimulation, that can very easily, especially with online shopping, that's such an easy thing. And
Yeah.
then the other side, so if you're an extreme saver, to the point where I've heard of people that save to the point where they're neglecting their basic needs,
Hmm.
and yet they have who knows how much money in the bank, is, like you said, avoiding the negative emotion. So that is, I would equate that akin to something like agoraphobia, for
Hmm.
example, where you are so afraid of the outdoors, or yeah, agoraphobia, especially with panic attacks. So, like, you're afraid of having a panic attack in public.
Hmm.
So you're avoiding this negative emotion by chasing an extreme behavior. That's the way. It could also function the same way, for example, that anorexia does, where it's something in your life that you have control over.
Yeah.
So you're denying. It gets to be an unhealthy level. You're restricting, you're denying, because it's the one thing in your life that you can control.
Yeah.
And so I can see psychologically, on the extremes of of those behaviors, the heart of that being something really maladaptive. And then
Hmm.
there's a lot of, there's
Yeah.
a lot in between on the spectrum. And too, the same, what's interesting to me is that this is kind of universal in psychology, is that it's not necessarily the behaviors that are wrong. It's not
Right.
wrong to save money. It's not wrong to spend money. It's A, the extent, and B, the psychological function of it,
Hmm.
and the heart function of it, and on a spiritual level as well, the heart function
Yeah.
of why we're doing what we're doing, and the ramifications of that in our lives.
It plays out in different ways too, not just about spending, but those who are more inclined to spend, we found that they're more willing to give, which is an interesting
Hmm.
dynamic. They're just not as tight-fisted with their money. They're willing
Yeah.
to give without thinking about it. And I will say though that we have family members who are spenders, and we have family members who are savers, and we've been given money by both of them, and
Wow.
obviously been very blessed. But I've noticed that those who are savers tend to be a little bit more intentional in the way that they give. So not that they're unwilling to give, but there seems to be a little bit more thought put into it, a
Yeah.
little bit more intentionality. They may build it into their budget because they
Yeah.
usually have a budget. And so it's, yeah, but those who are spenders seem to be able to I'll just write a check for this much. I would be a little bit more willing to give spontaneously.
Yeah. Yeah. And may even give more in
Yeah,
the end.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about risk versus reward. This is one of the more interesting discussions, I think, that we've had as you've gone through your different experiences.
Hmm.
Is it, if I lose 10%, is that the same emotionally to me as gaining 10%? So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, in the past, kind of traditional investment theories, what's called the modern portfolio theory, had this assumption that people responded to loss to the same degree that they responded to gain. And what they've been finding more recently, and what's given rise to what's called the postmodern portfolio theory, is that people have a stronger emotional response towards loss than they do towards gain. So if somebody, let's say, gains 10% in their investment, they'll have a positive response to that. They'll have good emotion, but it's going to be less intense than the negative emotion that they experience if they were to lose 10% in an investment. And so, yeah, there's definitely more. Most people on average will respond more strongly towards loss than to reward.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. I'm sure that you get a lot more calls when the market goes down of people freaking out than you do when the market goes up and people wanting to invest more money, which would be my guess. I don't know.
Typically,
What's
that's true. Yeah.
your experience on that?
It's
Yeah.
typically that's the case is people are on edge. We don't get a lot
Yeah.
of calls thanking us for all the good performance when the market's
Hmm.
shooting up.
But that makes sense, psychologically too. People have a negative emotion bias. We are
Hmm.
more likely to pay attention to the negative emotions of things than we do the positive. So, for example, in relationships, any relationship, marriage, anything, for every one negative interaction that you have with somebody, you have to have like something like five positive interactions to be able to say that you have a good relationship. So it's, yeah, so there's a huge negative bias that we have in our minds when we see something bad happen to us. It takes a lot more of the good experiences to outweigh that negative,
Mm.
which to an extent is functional, because it's protective. We need to be able to pay attention to threats and pay attention to risk.
Hmm.
Um, and so that makes sense. It's like a self-protective situation.
Yeah.
But yeah. So how do you approach that mindset of the risk versus reward with people, and how do you gauge people? I don't know, like talk a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a pretty embedded in the financial planning process itself, just across all advisors. As fiduciaries, financial planners are responsible to assess how much risk somebody wants to take on. So we have a quiz that we provide our clients just to get a sense of the amount of risk that they're willing to take on versus how much opportunity they want to try and reach for. So that's just one layer. We diversify. So diversification is a really important tool for managing risk. There's a lot of different kinds of investments, and each one comes with a pro and a con. And so when we construct our portfolios of investments, we're choosing different kinds of assets that may respond differently to the market. And so even if the one does poorly, maybe the other ones do well. It kind of smooths out the performance. And over the long term, hopefully it'll still perform well, but just with a lot less risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a difference in life stage as well, where when you're young, you take on a lot more risk because you can get a lot more of the reward that way.
Yeah. Typically a young person is saving for retirement, and that's, 20 to 30 years away. So if their investment loses 50%, they're still contributing out of their paycheck every month. That's actually a good time to buy is when the market is down. I think a sort of a psychological trick is when the market's down, you call it the market is discounted. When it's up, it's
Mm.
overpriced. Nobody wants to buy when it's overpriced. They want to buy items when it's discounted and when they're on sale.
Yeah.
And so for those who are saving for retirement, when the market goes down, they're buying their investments on sale, which is a
Hmm.
really good time to buy. The unfortunate thing is for people who are in retirement and they have to use their investments for their living expenses. Now they're selling their investments when the market is on sale. And that's when you start losing a lot of money.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
That makes
that's
a lot of
where
sense.
that's the time period to be a lot less risky is when you're nearing retirement.
So give me a little bit of some scriptural application to money. What does the Bible, in your opinion, what are some things that scripture has to say about the way that we manage our money and sort of some of the wisdom that scripture has there?
Yeah. First, I would say that the Bible talks about investing. You have the parable of the talents, and even though it's may not be directly a financial lesson, I think there's financial principles we can take out of it about the importance of being wise with what we're given to increase to be productive with the money and the skills that God's given to us, and to produce more than what we were given. And so I think investing, I think, there is a biblical, I think, how should I put this? I think the Bible does speak towards the wisdom of investing, and at the same time, I think there's a heart attitude behind it. You have Joseph, who saved a lot of the for 7 years of the good 7 years, the seven fat cows in his dream, and the seven fat ears of corn in his second dream. And he put a portion of each of those years of bounty away into reserves for the years of drought and famine. And that was a good thing. He was being wise. He was preparing for the future. He's preparing for times of want in the future. And that's, I think, a principle of saving that's important. But it's a hard attitude, because on the other side, we have the parable of the rich fool who keeps putting money away. And then at the end, he says in Luke, let's see here, Luke 12, it says there's a rich man, and he produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, so you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. God said to him, fool, this night your soul shall be required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. And so I think in Joseph's case, he was being wise. He was preparing for the future. In this man's case, he was saving for himself, so he could just be self-indulgent. And I think that's the heart behind this, is he didn't want to produce to better other people. He wanted to produce so he can just relax and not do anything further with his life. And God calls that foolish. At the same time, we're not called to be anxious. So the very next passage in that Luke chapter I just read is about the sparrows. It says, consider the lilies. They neither toil nor spin. But Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. If God clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, how much more will he clothe you? So do not seek what you are to eat or to drink, nor be worried, for all the nations seek after these things, but your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. So there's a call to not be anxious about our material, what we've been given, our material things. But at the same time, I think we're called to be diligent, to work hard, to be wise with what we've been given. And so I think there's sort of twin truths on both sides. We shouldn't be afraid that the sky is going to fall tomorrow and we will be left with nothing. I think that that level of fear can be a sign of a weakness of faith, because it's not ultimately our investment portfolio that
Yeah.
will supply our needs. It's ultimately God who does that. But at the same time, we should be wise in how we're preparing for the future.
And I think there's a difference in heart. I like what you said about how it's more about the heart attitude in which you do something
Mm-hmm.
rather than something else. I think in the Christian culture a lot there is this idea of asceticism
Mm-hmm.
almost, where you should give everything away. You shouldn't save for the future. You should just, yeah, you should give everything away. You should basically live in rags. It's a shameful thing to have wealth and seek to have wealth. And I think that attitude is wrong. I mean, there is huge danger on the other side. You can't serve two masters. You have to serve God. You can't serve money and God at the same time. So I think there is a huge temptation when you do have wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, it talks about, it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than to enter the kingdom of heaven. But that's more because of that is the attitude. That's the lack of faith, of the reliance on myself, the idea that I'll be okay in myself, in my investment portfolio. Nothing can touch me. I can save myself. It's it reflects the hard attitude more than
Right.
it does the having of the money itself. And then also what you do with it as well. We are called to give and to be generous, and not to seek this kingdom because moth and rust destroys.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's a balance there, and yeah, heart attitude.
Yeah, First Timothy 6 is instructions for the rich. It doesn't tell them not to give all their money away so that they become poor, but it says, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. And so it's when it's the worship of money and wealth
Mhm.
where that's when I think we start to have an unhealthy relationship with our money. But I mean, even right here, we're kind of coming back to some of the themes we've already talked about, where the rich people are told to be generous, to be ready to share, but also to be rich in good works, but also to set our hope on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. This is kind of
Mhm.
going back to my own story where I felt I was not enjoying what God had given me. So this is a call to the savers out there who are, who they can't enjoy their money because they're so afraid. I would encourage you to think of ways that you can learn how to enjoy your spending your money, because that is something God's given you. And then one last little twist in all of this I want to share, because it's a Bible verse. I read it a few years ago and I had to do a double take because I'm like, wait, Jesus really said this? And he said, I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwelling. And that's Luke 16:9. And there's a sense where
Wow.
you can use money to advance the kingdom. I,
Yeah.
I see a lot of thought within the Christian community where there tends to be a disrespect for money, that, well, God doesn't use money. God works, and money is kind of irrelevant in his kingdom. But I think it is used in his kingdom. He doesn't say that money is worthless. I think it's useful when it's viewed in its rightful place.
And ultimately, I mean, the scripture uses, when scripture describes God's kingdom, he describes it, it's described as wealth. It's
Mhm.
described as streets of pure gold, the cattle on a thousand hills. So if there's wealth in the kingdom, that's not a bad thing. Yeah, it's the way, but it's for
Yeah.
God's glory and his kingdom. That's what that's for.
Kind of a few years ago, I walked away thinking kind of the ascetic approach that a lot of Christians take, where it's like, well, it's just money. It's not worth anything. I shouldn't have to worry about it. God's got me. It's sort of like, a parent who gives their child a gift and the child just like discards it, and they're like, yeah, it doesn't
Mm.
matter. I just want to be with my dad. It's kind of a hurtful thing. We
Yeah.
need to recognize that the money that God's given us is a gift, and we can enjoy God by appreciating what he's given to us.
But if they use that gift, like the dad gave him a video game and then he never wants to associate with his dad ever again,
Yeah.
that's the wrong thing.
He's
But
he's too
if the
busy playing
son
the video game. He doesn't have time for his dad anymore, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But if he's like, "Dad, come play with me. Let's spend time together." "Thank you so much, Dad." Like, as something that brings them closer. That's a thing of beauty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just kind of going back to my own story, I was the kid who received a gift and didn't want to play with it
Yeah.
because I didn't feel like it was for me to enjoy.
You felt guilty
Felt guilty
receiving a
to
gift.
play with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's something I've struggled with too that I've been really active in trying to foster is because I think I have a lot of pride in being self-sufficient as
Mhm.
well. And so like instead of yeah, and feeling guilty for when people give me gifts, just fostering and communicating thankfulness and how much that is really helpful, how much I really do appreciate what people give me because I do. And
Mhm.
I think that has Yeah, because when I give gifts, it feels really good for me for that person to really appreciate it and
Hmm.
for it to really meet a need and for them to really use it and make it their own and enjoy it. That's what I want when I give somebody a gift.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I try to foster that in myself and communicate that to people that give me gifts as well. All right. Well, and then there's one thing I know you have to give a disclaimer.
Yes.
There's some legalese we need to include here to make sure that people who are listening to this are
Yeah.
using what we talk about appropriately.
Yeah.
So what is
So yes, I work with Family Focused Financial, and we're in the Southwest Michigan area, and we also have an office in Mishawaka, Indiana. Our website is famfolkfinancial.com if you're interested in connecting with us. We'd love to talk to you about your situation. But we work with a company called Harbor Investments. So we offer our securities and advisory services through Harbor Investments Incorporated, and we're a member of the SIPC. And so, yeah, if you want to look into our company, we'd be more than happy to talk.
thanks for indulging me coming on my podcast.
Yeah.
I have Yeah, and to tell the people, one of the ways that Grant and I connected was when I was in grad school, he was post college. He came to a college age, activity from my church. Yeah, and one of the things that we connected on was that he was a psych major.
Hmm.
And of course I was in psychology. And so we started our foundation of our relationship talking about psychology,
Yep.
and it's something
Psychoanalyzed
that we
each other
often
and figured each
that's
other out.
right. We figured each other out. Yeah, diagnosed all the personality disorders. So it's been fun to share with the people some of the conversations we have
Yeah.
together. It's been a fun experience. But
And if any of you were wondering, yes, this is pretty much just a normal conversation that Ashley and I have on the regular. So,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Minus the kid interruptions, you
yes,
know,
which we have edited
every
out.
10
If any
seconds.
of you are wondering, there's been a lot
We
of
did
kid
edit. We did edit one in particular.
Yes.
I'll spare you the details. But yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. And if you enjoyed this, I have an e-course where I discuss how to understand psychology from a Christian perspective using the framework of systematic theology. So if you are interested in that e-course, it's on udemy.com. I have a link in the description. I will also link the Family Focused Financial website. So if you're interested in seeing what services they have to offer, you can check them out. But hope you all have a great week, and I'll talk to you next time.